It's Friday again. The whole week has gone by. I'm sure you had great plans for this week. You probably had a whole bunch of goals that you hoped to achieve and probably achieved at least one of them, or we would hope so. But so often we get to the end of the week with something that was left unfinished and maybe something that we wished would happen. You know, one of the things that philosophers are forever telling us and spiritual teachers are forever telling us is the importance of living in the present. There's so much written about that and spoken about that in spiritual texts, and it sounds so easy. We've heard countless stories about, the present is the gift, the past and the future can't be controlled. I've spoken about that many times on this show, and here we find ourselves talking about it again because what I want to talk about today is a very important topic, a very important emotional issue that all of us face, and really it plugs right back in to that ancient advice that we always got about living in the present and why it's the happiest and safest state to be in. What is it about the present that helps us deal with this very powerful emotion that we all have to face often in our lives? The emotion of regret. Regret plays a big part in our culture. It's one of those emotions that we have all experienced, and we all do experience, perhaps a little bit more often than we'd like to. It's such a major feature of our experience of life and our challenge of being a human being that you'll find all sorts of popular culture about regret, whether they be stories and plays and dramas and novels and of course songs. Frank Sinatra famously sang, "Regrets, I've had a few and now I face the final curtain." So it's like, oh dear, here I go, and I'm like maybe about to pop off this planet and I've got to deal with regret. What am I going to do about that? Whereas Edith Piaf just as famously sang, "I regret nothing." Who's right? Should we be contemplating all the kind of stuff that went wrong that leads to our regrets before we shuffle off this mortal coil and complete our path here on earth and not leave with any baggage, because well, that baggage seems to be dying with regrets, seems to be a problem. And then it's like unfinished business. Dying with regrets is clearly some kind of unfinished business. Or is Piaf right who says, don't regret anything? I have no regrets. What's the point of regret? I had a friend who said, never do anything that you would regret, and never regret anything that you've done. And that simple little statement is, while easier said than done, a very good piece of advice, because we should try not to do anything that we regret, but if we do regret something, well, going on about it or harping on about it or worrying about it all the time is precisely what causes this emotional problem, this emotional dissonance that causes us to feel such pain, because regret can be an extremely painful emotion. Essentially, regret is generally defined as an emotional state that arises out of blame, and of course out of blaming ourselves. We blame ourselves for some outcome that didn't happen or that was a bad outcome in some way, and holding ourselves responsible for that, it leads to sorrow. It often feels to feeling of loss, what could have been and what might have been, or our wishes didn't come true and what we wanted kind of ran into a wall. Maybe that negative emotion has arisen out of a choice that we made that we can't undo, but that had consequences that we wish we could avoid. And we live in the regret of that choice, that it's now too late to do something about it. Basically, the less opportunity that we have to change a situation that exists in the past, the more that turns into regret, which turns into a negative feedback loop of constantly thinking about it and worrying about it and developing both emotional and even physical illness that can arise out of that. Continuously contemplating things that you cannot change that existed in the past causes stress, because the stress response is saying, I've got to do something, and well, there's probably, almost certainly, nothing that you can do. That damages your mind, it damages your body, and gets you into a kind of vicious cycle because, well, what can we do about regrets? We'll try and address that topic by the end of the show tonight. And is there any way that we can actually shift this, any way to change ourselves? What do the experts think about it? Well, certainly from the emotional point of view, regret has a strong link with depression. Because it's a kind of a pointless and fruitless worrying about something over and over again, and the mind and the behavior is then occupied with thinking about this past event that basically there's little you can do about it, and there's little thinking about it that's going to help. So the mind and the self are trapped in engaging something that goes nowhere and probably doesn't even have any action associated with it. So there really is very little that we can do. This kind of blocks life and leads into a pattern of negative thinking focused on oneself, on blame and recrimination focused on oneself. And blame and recrimination are characteristics of some aspects of depression. So the constant awareness of our regrets and the constant focusing on those things that we regret causes the same emotional state as depression, and ultimately can cause depression. On the other hand, there are even physical problems that arise out of that, and you may know, of course, that depression can also induce physical problems because stress affects the hormone balances and, most importantly, affects the immune system. And the stress of constant self-recrimination can cause the immune system to become depressed, can cause us to become ill, and other functions can be depressed, and that gets into a kind of a negative feedback loop, because as our immune system is down, we become increasingly unable to deal with whatever is attacking us, both physically and emotionally. And so it creates this negative feedback loop, creates this negative effect on body, mind, spirit, and leads us into an impossible state. It prevents us from recovering from stress because it gets us into this negative loop of what causes the stress in the first place. When it comes to regret, it's much more difficult to reduce or remove the source of stress compared with when you can identify a source of stress in the present tense. So one of the important things about living in the present is that you are able to address your problems that are in the present because you're in the present. If something is stressing you now, you can address the source of that stress and in the end minimize or remove the impact of it. If something is causing stress that occurred in the past and the past can't be reached by you and the past can't be changed by you, then you're in a situation where you've got a source of stress that cannot be removed. It cannot be healed because we can't access the past. You can't go back there and change anything, as well we know. That's the whole problem with regret in the first place. But regret has become a form of stress, and it might be true that regret sits there in the past and there's very little you can do about it, but if stress is sitting there in the past, it's actually causing illness, and there's very little you can do about it. So we need to understand that regret is actually a dangerous emotion. It's not only a negative emotion, it's a dangerous emotion because it's capable of causing problems that are almost impossible to cure. If we were comparing this to some kind of a physical illness, we'd be saying, it's one of those that you need to nip in the bud early, because if you don't nip it in the bud early, it leads to complications that include emotional and physical illnesses, and extreme situations can lead to even worse problems than that. That makes sense for many things, but once we identify that if we create an unsolvable problem that sits in the past, we've created an unsolvable problem like illness or stress in the present. So nip it in the bud. How do we do that? We have to find a way to understand what's causing regret really, and to be able to identify, are there any regrets that are worth it? Are there any regrets that we can do anything about? Or more importantly, why does regret harm us so badly? The latest ideas about regret, and the most interesting ideas about regrets and what really causes them, why they are so powerful, the strongest regrets that we have seem to arise between the difference between some kind of ideal version of ourselves and the actual self and the actual life that we're living out. Regrets are often based on I ought to do something, and I ought to have done something, and I'm feeling bad, sad, and regretful because I didn't do it. It's very often thought that regret is because there is this gap between what I ought to have done and what I did do, or who I ought to have been and who I turned out to be. And that ought to have been is kind of related to this third idea of the self as this ideal self. So we have some regrets that we experience because we didn't do what we ought to have done. And then one step further than that, we have those regrets that are based on I didn't do what I could have done if I was a better person, if I had done the right thing, if I had done what I believed that I would do, or believed what I am capable of. We all carry this idealized version of ourselves. It comes out in different forms, it pops up in different places, here, there, and everywhere. But it's now thought that the regrets that really are the most stubborn are those that differ between the actual self and the ideal self, even more than the ought to self. You're much more likely to worry about and linger on what you could have done than what you should have done. Because the should have done is, I know what I'm supposed to do. I know what the right thing to do, or what is expected of me by other people, or by the world, or by the general rules of society. But when it's the could have, it's suggesting there's some ideal version of ourselves. If I was a better person, I would have done that, is like saying, I could be that person. I could have been the person who did the right thing. The psychologist Edward Higgins puts it this way. He says, so these three selves, the actual self, the ought to have been self, and the ideal self. He says, the actual self is your concept of yourself and how you represent yourself to yourself, the traits that you have and that you believe that you have. Whereas the ideal self represents all those things you would like to have that might relate to your future goals or your wishes or those bigger visions you have of yourself. And your ought to self is your way of seeing those qualities that you believe that are socially required of you, that you have obligations and duties towards others, towards your society, and towards the rules. So those three selves are carried around in our head. And when there's a discrepancy between them, between any of them, a number of negative emotions can arise. So when you experience a discrepancy between your actual self and your ought to self, you experience sadness and disappointment. It's like you feel that you're failing to live up to some vision of yourself that you have, and that is going to produce sadness and depression because it's an abstract situation that you can do nothing about. Now other people are involved. So these emotions are very hard to change. When you do something that differs with your ought to self, the emotions that you experience there are things like guilt or fear because they are directed towards other people. Is there going to be some response from them? I fear their response, or I feel bad about something. So those kinds of negative emotions are regrets that drive us to do something about it. It might not be easy to do something about it, but there's the possibility of doing something about it. I can deal with that person. I can go back and try and do the right thing because somebody is hurt. Maybe I can't even, but it creates that motivation that says I can do something about it. When we have a gap between our actual self and ideal self, there is very little we can do about it, and those regrets stay. The who we could have been is not quite the same as what did I do wrong. Because when I did something wrong, well, we can usually try and address that. That's what guilt is for, it's what it means in court. And often there's some redress that you can make. And maybe you can't undo what was done, but there might be some redress that can take away some of the guilt and fear. So that's the very least. And those kind of regrets are manageable. But regrets which show this gap between who you could have been or who you should have been or whatever, those have incredible staying power. And it's true with everyone. They won't go away because there's very little we can do, and they tend to haunt us. And although psychologists describe those as cold regrets as opposed to hot ones, the hot ones, I've got to do something about it, I need to fix this, I need to make them feel better. The cold ones, we kind of put away until later, and there's nothing I can do about that right now. So we put them away until later, and I'll deal with myself later, and maybe I'll try and aspire better to being that other person, but the regret hasn't been dealt with. And psychologists suggest that those kind of regrets that are kind of shelved because we can do nothing about them work slowly on us, and over years can create great negativity, bitterness, depression, and can actually seriously damage the trajectory of our lives. So one of the things that also distinguishes between the different types of regrets is how they actually change us. So some regrets will motivate us to change. Because that wrong thing happened in the past, I can now try and do better. It's often said why young people don't suffer as much from regret because they've got more time to do something about it. Maybe true. But the point really is that some regrets motivate change. And those kind of regrets, of course, are the ones that we can move on from. So you didn't accept that job, next time I'm going to accept it. But if you regret not marrying your sweetheart, and your sweetheart is now married to someone else, well, there's very little you can do about that kind of regret. So again, we get trapped into that situation where there's no opportunity to do anything about it. So one of the things we can learn to do is look at our regrets and see the difference, see that difference. Is there something about the past that I can learn from in terms of this regret, or is there another strategy that is required? You know, one of the most challenging things about being a human being is that we have to make choices, and we have to make the right choice somehow. And also once we make a choice, you know, all the other possibilities disappear. So how do we know the right choice? So we set ourselves up for regret all the time, and we must assume regret is a natural emotion, and it is a useful emotion if it motivates us to do something that either undoes the wrong that we did or makes it not happen in the future and makes a better decision in the future. And that's why we need to be concerned about those regrets that we don't do anything about, the cold emotions that build up over years, because well, what can we do? We feel sad, I'm not that person I thought I was, or I want to be, what can I really do about it? And that's the one that causes problems later on. So what is the opinion on doing something about it, on changing the regret? How do we cope with regret? Well, the first thing, of course, is we need to be willing to change, and that's how to cope with most things. But the first thing is to ask ourselves the question, well, how can I benefit from this? Can it tell me to look at my choices better? Or is it telling me that my actions tend to lead to negative consequences? Change your actions. So first step is to identify, how could I do something different? What is the function of the regret? It's telling me you did it wrong. Is it one of those things I could do something different? How could I have made a different choice? The second thing is to realize that if there is nothing you can do to change it, then let it go. Because there's nothing you can do. If you get stuck in blame and self-recrimination and regret and all of those kind of things, as I've said before, with nothing to change the past situation, those become the truths of it. The regrettability and the sadness and the loss becomes the truth, because you can't go back and change anything. All you can do is try and let go. And how do you do that? Work on forgiving yourself. Forgiving yourself leads to letting go. So, powerful way to live in the present is forgiving yourself. The third thing is watch blame, and watch blaming yourself, because not all the blame is necessarily yours. Sometimes consider that what made you make the wrong choice was not necessarily in your hands. You might not even have all the information at the time when you made the choice. Perhaps you had to make the choice very quickly, or a quick decision, or something like that. So be careful not to unnecessarily make the stress too much on yourself. And then finally, what you can also do, if you think about life as a journey and we're learning all these lessons, even though there's nothing you can necessarily do to change what happened in the past, you can try and frame it differently. You can frame it as a situation where I learnt about myself, a situation when I learnt about the difference between our ideal self and my actual self, or finding some way where you can own it in a way that is not negatively affecting you. So even those regrets that we can do nothing about, in the sense that in the past, we can also change them into the hotter kind of regrets where we're motivated to do something. And that's also a powerful thought. While there is a difference between those things I can go back and say sorry for, whatever, and those things I can't because it's my ideal self, what I can do is turn that disappointment about my ideal self into a motivation to grow spiritually, to go to therapy, to learn more about myself, to motivate myself to get better in a way that is not directly related to that. And that's another way of reducing the stressful impact of it. A powerful technique. We can't talk about this without popping in to what do the Stoics, of course, have to say about this. The Stoics were big on don't hang on to old negative emotions. Negative emotions are our biggest block, and so we need to find a way to get rid of them. So that informs their approach to regret, which there are two things that the Stoics have a problem with regret about. The first is that it interferes with that equanimity, that calmness and dispassionate emotion that we seek. And secondly, it breaks the fundamental Stoic rule of don't obsess about those things you have no control over, and of course you have no control over the past. It doesn't mean the Stoics moved on without thinking about, and no regrets meant they could do anything bad. In fact, it's a very important Stoic principle to sit every day at the end of the day and ask yourself, what bad habit of yours have you cured today? What vice have you cheated today? In what respect are you better? The Stoics say if you ask yourselves those questions every day, you will have no anger, you will become more gentle, and you will probably not do things that you regret. I'll finish with a thought from the Canadian psychologist Nick Hobson. He says, it all depends on who you are and what you're trying to achieve. If you define yourself more by your obligations and your responsibilities, the ought to self, then you would be wise to think carefully before you involve close other people in your life. And on the other hand, if you are more guided by your ideal self, your personal ideals, then you'll be happier if you decide on the things that move you closer to your ideals. In other words, the first step in reducing regret is just to know yourself. Indeed, self-knowledge is the root of all freedom, because ultimately, the only freedom that exists is the freedom of your mind. I'll see you back here next week at the usual time.